In the suffocating Mississippi summer heat of 1874, 13 plantation masters jolted awake to a nightmare far worse than any death. Their wives had simply vanished, gone without a trace from locked bedrooms, leaving behind just the lingering scent of jasmine and a single black feather resting on clean white pillows. Before the day was over, letters would arrive for these men, destroying them in ways no bullet or sharpened blade could ever achieve. These letters held secrets so devastating, so personally humiliating, that several of those masters would choose suicide over facing the public disgrace. Yet this wasn't the doing of ghosts or demons, as some would later whisper. It was the cold, calculated revenge of a man who had been stripped of everything by these very plantation owners. A man forced to witness his own family ripped apart and sold off like livestock to distant corners of the South. A man who had spent 8 long years crafting the ultimate vengeance, one designed not just to kill his enemies, but to obliterate their legacies, demolish their reputations, and ensure their names lived on only as bywords for shame and mockery across future generations. They called him the Black Widower, though few ever learned his true name. And by the time that truth surfaced, it was far too late. The destruction was complete. 13 of Mississippi's most influential men had been broken, not by violence, but by something infinitely more devastating, the total annihilation of everything they held sacred. Their honor, their reputations, the carefully polished images they'd cultivated as respectable gentlemen, all of it reduced to ash by a man they had once owned. A man whose humanity they had never once acknowledged. Before I lay out exactly how this man pulled off one of the most intricate revenge plots in American history, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this, ones that drag the darkest corners of our past into the light, that show how the oppressed sometimes found ways to strike back, that's exactly what we uncover on this channel. And drop a comment telling me the most elaborate revenge story you've ever heard, because I guarantee nothing will match what you're about to hear. This is a tale that will force you to rethink everything you thought you understood about justice, about vengeance, and about just how far human patience and planning can stretch. The story doesn't kick off in 1874, but 16 years earlier, during the brutal summer of 1858, on a cotton plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, called Riverside Manor. This wasn't just any plantation. It ranked among the most prosperous in the entire state, over 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land worked by more than 200 enslaved people who labored from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, producing the white gold that made their master one of the wealthiest men in the South. The master of Riverside Manor was Colonel Marcus Whitmore, a man who fancied himself a gentleman farmer. He was one of those plantation owners who liked to imagine they were benevolent patriarchs, providing for their people while conveniently ignoring that those people were held in bondage, bought and sold at auction, ripped from their families on a whim, and subjected to violence whenever they stepped out of line. Whitmore would tell visitors that he treated his slaves well, that he was a Christian master who understood his responsibilities before God. He'd point out how he let enslaved families live together in cabins instead of separating them into gender-specific barracks. He'd mention that he rarely used the whip himself, preferring to delegate such unpleasant tasks to his overseers. He spoke with genuine conviction about his role as caretaker of people who were, in his view, incapable of caring for themselves. This self-deception ran deep among the planter class. It was a necessary fiction that let them sleep at night despite the systematic brutality underpinning their wealth. Whitmore genuinely believed he was a good man, a moral man, a man history would judge favorably. He had no ability to grasp that from the perspective of those he enslaved, his occasional kindnesses meant nothing against their fundamental lack of freedom, their inability to make choices about their own lives, their constant awareness that any moment could see them or their loved ones sold off to cover a debt or settle a business deal. Whitmore belonged to a tight circle of 13 plantation masters who controlled not just Adams County's economy, but virtually every aspect of life within it. They gathered monthly at the Natchez Gentlemen's Club, a Greek Revival mansion perched on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. There they'd smoke Cuban cigars, drink French brandy imported at tremendous expense, discuss politics and cotton prices, arrange marriages between their children, and make decisions affecting thousands of lives without ever consulting those whose very existence hung in the balance. These meetings were social affairs, but also exercises in raw power. The 13 men formed an interlocking network of control stretching into every corner of Adams County society. They decided who got credit and who didn't. They determined which cases came before the courts and how those cases would be resolved. They controlled access to education, economic opportunity, political participation. They were, in essence, a shadow government more powerful than any elected official, accountable to no one except each other. These 13 men represented the absolute peak of Southern aristocracy. There was Colonel Marcus Whitmore of Riverside Manor, the unofficial leader, owner of 240 slaves, widely considered the richest man in the county, whose word carried more weight than any law or regulation. Then came Judge Bogard Sinclair of Oakwood Plantation, a circuit court judge who used his position to shield slaveholder interests and punish anyone challenging the social order. He was notorious for creative legal interpretations that always seemed to benefit the planter class and for harsh sentences handed down to free black people who stepped out of line. Dr. Cornelius Hampton of Magnolia Heights served as Natchez' most prominent physician, but his real contribution to the circle was providing medical justifications for slavery. He wrote papers arguing that black people were biologically inferior, with smaller brains, naturally suited to labor in hot climates, that slavery actually benefited their health compared to the supposed rigors of freedom. These pseudo-scientific arguments appeared in Southern medical journals and were cited by politicians defending the institution. Reverend Isaiah Payton of Willow Creek Estate brought religious authority to the group. As a Baptist minister, he preached every Sunday that slavery was ordained by God, that the curse of Ham explained why black people were destined to be servants, that slaves should submit to their masters as to Christ himself. His sermons provided moral cover for the entire system, letting slaveholders feel they were doing God's work rather than committing an ongoing crime against humanity. Captain Theodore Ashford of Ashford Acres, a former military officer, ran his plantation like an army camp and his slaves like soldiers under command. He maintained rigid discipline, conducted morning inspections, and punished infractions with military precision. He believed efficiency and order were keys to successful plantation management and shared his methods with other circle members. Attorney Harrison Blackwood of Blackwood Hall specialized in slave law, drafting contracts for slave sales, defending masters accused of excessive cruelty, and finding legal loopholes letting slaveholders evade the few restrictions on their power. He was brilliant at his work, able to argue black was white and up was down if it served his client's interests. Banker Silas Rutherford of Cedar Grove financed slave purchases and plantation expansions, profiting from human misery while maintaining an air of respectability. He'd calculated the exact monetary value of human beings of different ages, skills, and physical conditions, reducing people to numbers in a ledger. Mayor Jonathan Prescott of Twin Oaks was the planter class's political face, ensuring local governments served their interests exclusively. He appointed sheriffs and tax assessors, controlled government contract distribution, and crushed any challenges to the social order before they gained momentum. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell of Pinehurst enforced slave codes with brutal efficiency and personally led slave patrols terrorizing the black community, both enslaved and free. He seemed to genuinely enjoy hunting runaway slaves, breaking up secret church meetings, ensuring black people understood their place. Merchant William Doggett of Rosewood owned Natchez' largest general store and refused to sell to free black people, ensuring their economic dependence on white intermediaries charging higher prices. Cotton factor Edmund Weatherly of Belmont was the middleman selling the region's cotton to northern and European markets, making enormous commissions while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a neutral businessman facilitating trade. Overseer Coordinator Jasper Thornton of Thornfield supplied and trained overseers for multiple plantations, teaching them the most effective control and punishment methods. He ran what amounted to an overseer school where young white men learned intimidation techniques, strategic violence use, and the psychological manipulation needed to control large groups of enslaved people. Finally, plantation manager Vincent Hargrove of Hargrove House managed several absentee-owned plantations and pioneered new techniques for maximizing labor extraction, constantly experimenting with ways to get more work out of enslaved people while minimizing costs, treating human beings as machines to be optimized. These 13 men formed an interlocking power network. They intermarried their children to consolidate holdings, creating dynastic alliances lasting generations. They invested in each other's ventures, sharing risks and profits. They covered each other's crimes, providing alibis and false testimony when needed. They presented a united front against any challenge to the slave system that had made them unimaginably wealthy. When abolitionists published pamphlets criticizing slavery, these men organized public burnings of the offending literature. When Northern politicians spoke about limiting slavery's expansion, these men contributed money to Southern rights candidates. When enslaved people resisted through work slowdowns or subtle sabotage, these men compared notes on the most effective punishments. They saw themselves as civilization's defenders, standing against the chaos that would supposedly result if black people were freed. And in the summer of 1858, they made a decision that would seem insignificant to them, just another business transaction in a lifetime of such transactions, but that would set in motion events eventually destroying them all. It was the kind of decision they made routinely, without thought or hesitation, the kind that illustrated the absolute power they held over human lives. On Riverside Manor lived an enslaved family that seemed, by slavery standards, relatively fortunate. Thomas was 35 and worked as a skilled carpenter. He'd learned the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father, a line of craftsmanship stretching back through generations. Thomas could build furniture both beautiful and functional, construct outbuildings standing for decades, repair almost anything that broke. His skill made him valuable to Colonel Whitmore, and that value translated into small privileges. His wife Clara, 32, worked as a seamstress in the main house, creating and repairing garments for the Whitmore family. She had quick, clever fingers and an eye for detail that made her indispensable to Mrs. Whitmore, who prided herself on being Natchez society's best-dressed woman. Together, Thomas and Clara had 4 children. Marcus, their eldest at 14, was beginning to learn carpentry from his father, showing promise with his hands and eye for measurement. Elizabeth, 12, helped her mother with sewing and had begun learning to read secretly, taught by an elderly enslaved woman educated before laws prohibited such instruction. Samuel, 8, was bright and curious, full of questions about how things worked, always following his father around the plantation asking why and how and what if. And little Grace, only 5, was the family's joy, a cheerful child whose laughter could make even the hardest forced labor day bearable. Thomas and Clara had managed what many enslaved couples couldn't. They'd kept their family together. They lived in a small cabin at the slave quarter's edge, cramped but their own, a space where they could close the door and pretend for a few hours each night that they were free, just a family like any other. They told their children stories, taught them skills, tried preparing them for lives that might one day include freedom, though neither parent truly believed they'd live to see emancipation. Thomas occupied an ambiguous position in the plantation hierarchy. His carpentry skills made him valuable, gave him slightly more autonomy than field hands, slightly better food, a small weekly allowance he could use to buy extra provisions or save towards some dimly imagined future. But that slight privilege was also precarious, depending entirely on Whitmore's goodwill, which could evaporate any moment for any reason or none at all. Thomas understood this. He'd seen skilled artisans sold away for minor infractions, watched families more stable than his own broken up to settle debts or punish perceived disrespect. He lived with constant low-level anxiety, always aware that everything he loved could be taken in an instant. And in August 1858, that anxiety proved justified. Colonel Whitmore had accumulated substantial gambling debts during a New Orleans trip. He'd spent 2 weeks there ostensibly on cotton business, but actually in gambling houses, drinking heavily and making increasingly reckless bets. He fancied himself skilled at cards, but in reality, he was easy prey for professional gamblers who knew how to manipulate drunk, overconfident plantation owners. By the time Whitmore returned to Natchez, he owed $12,000 to various creditors, debts needing quick payment to avoid scandal and potential legal action. For a man of Whitmore's wealth, $12,000 shouldn't have been catastrophic, but he'd overextended himself in other investments, and his liquid capital was limited. The easiest way to raise cash quickly was to sell some of his property, specifically, his human property. Whitmore consulted with his circle of 13, several of whom were in the market for skilled labor or domestic servants, and they devised a plan benefiting all of them while maximizing Whitmore's profit. They would break up Thomas's family and sell members separately. This strategy made economic sense from the slaveholder's perspective. Families sold together brought lower prices than individuals sold separately. A skilled carpenter like Thomas could command a higher price if sold alone to someone specifically needing carpentry skills. Children sold individually could be trained to new owners' specific requirements without parental influence. It was purely a business calculation, the kind made thousands of times across the South with no more moral weight than deciding which fields to plant with cotton and which with corn. The specific plan was this: Marcus, the 14-year-old boy just reaching age for adult labor, would go to Judge Sinclair, who needed field hands for his expanding cotton operation and liked acquiring young men he could train from early age to be obedient and efficient. Elizabeth, the 12-year-old girl, would go to Reverend Peyton, whose wife wanted a personal maid trainable to her specific preferences, young enough not to have developed bad habits from previous owners. Samuel, the 8-year-old, would go to Captain Ashford, who liked acquiring young boys and training them from childhood to be loyal personal servants, believing early training produced the most devoted slaves. Little Grace, only 5, would stay with Whitmore temporarily, then be sold at the next major Natchez slave auction, where young children often fetched good prices from speculators who'd raise and resell them later, or from plantations wanting to breed future slave generations. As for Thomas and Clara, Whitmore initially planned to keep them, but attorney Blackwood made an offer for the couple. Blackwood had a Louisiana contact needing skilled slaves for a plantation being developed in Bayou country. The buyer was willing to pay premium prices for a carpenter and seamstress, especially married ones who might be more stable and less likely to run away. Whitmore accepted, effectively ensuring Thomas and Clara would never see their children again. Louisiana was hundreds of miles away, and enslaved people had no means of communication over such distances. The sale would sever the family completely and permanently. The transaction was arranged on a Thursday afternoon in mid-August at the Natchez Gentlemen's Club. The 13 men gathered in their usual back room, surrounded by mahogany furniture and oil paintings of long-dead plantation owners. Money changed hands, gold coins and promissory notes carefully counted and recorded. Documents were signed and witnessed, legal papers treating human beings as livestock, describing Thomas as one Negro man, skilled carpenter, age approximately 35 years, and his wife as one Negro woman, seamstress, age approximately 32 years. The children were similarly reduced to inventory items, their ages and potential uses noted with the same attention given to describing a horse's age and temperament. Brandy was poured to celebrate the successful negotiation. The 13 men congratulated each other on their business acumen. Whitmore's gambling debts would be covered. The others had acquired useful slaves at fair prices. Everyone was satisfied. The business concluded in less than an hour, and the men moved on to other topics, discussing politics and cotton prices and the upcoming social season. None gave a second thought to the family they'd just destroyed. They'd executed hundreds of similar transactions over their lifetimes. This was simply how business was done. Thomas knew nothing of this transaction until Saturday morning. He'd been sent into town Friday to purchase supplies and repair tools, an errand taking most of the day. He returned to Riverside Manor late evening, tired but looking forward to seeing his family, having dinner with them in their cabin, hearing about his children's day. When he reached the cabin, he found it empty, not just empty of people, but empty of their few possessions. The small trunk where Clara kept their clothes was gone. The pallet where the children slept was bare. The few cooking implements they'd owned had been removed. For a moment, Thomas stood in the doorway, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Then panic set in. He ran to the main house, ignoring protocol requiring enslaved people to approach slowly and wait acknowledgement. He pounded on the back door until the cook opened it, looking frightened at his urgency. "Where is my family?" Thomas demanded. "Where are Clara and the children?" The cook, an elderly woman who'd known Thomas his entire life, looked at him with pity and fear. She told him softly they'd been taken away that morning, that Overseer Davis had come with a wagon and several white men, that Clara had been crying, the children screaming, but they'd been loaded into the wagon and driven away. Thomas ran to the overseer's house near the main plantation where Davis lived. He demanded to know where his family had been taken, what was happening, when they'd return. Davis looked at him with irritation and contempt. "Your family has been sold," Davis said flatly. "The colonel needed to raise some money, and he sold them. Your wife is going to Louisiana. The children have been sold to different folks around the county. That's all I know, and that's all you need to know. Now get back to your cabin before I have you whipped for disturbing me." Thomas felt his legs give out. He sank to his knees in the dirt outside Davis's house, his mind reeling. Sold. His wife sold to Louisiana. His children scattered to different owners around Adams County. His family destroyed, erased, as if the 15 years he'd spent building a life with Clara, the 14 years raising his children, meant nothing, as if they were objects redistributable at will with no more consideration than selling furniture or livestock. He didn't remember walking back to his cabin. He didn't remember how long he sat there in the dark, his mind circling endlessly around the impossibility of what had happened. It was an impossible plan. He didn't know exactly where Clara had been taken, only that it was somewhere in Louisiana. He didn't know which plantations his children had been sold to, only that they were somewhere in Adams County. He had no money, no resources, no allies. Running away was extremely dangerous, and captured runaways faced horrific punishments. But Thomas didn't care about danger or consequences anymore. His family was gone, and if he couldn't find them, he'd at least die trying rather than continue living as if their loss was acceptable. On Saturday night, Thomas packed a small bag with a few tools, some food stolen from plantation stores, and a knife he used for carpentry. He waited until after midnight when the plantation was quiet and patrols had passed through his section. Then he set out heading east toward woods bordering Riverside Manor, planning to travel at night and hide during day until he was far enough from Natchez to be safe. He made it less than 5 miles. The slave patrols operating throughout Adams County were efficient and experienced in hunting human beings. They had dogs trained to track scent. They knew all likely routes runaways would take, and they were motivated by substantial rewards paid for captured escapees. Thomas heard the dogs before he saw them, their baying in the distance growing steadily closer. He tried running faster, tried finding a stream to lose his scent, but he was exhausted from grief and lack of sleep, and the dogs were faster. They caught him at a creek's edge, hounds surrounding him while handlers approached with guns drawn. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell, one of the 13 plantation masters, led the patrol that night. He looked at Thomas with satisfaction, seeing another runaway captured, another demonstration of white authority successfully enforced. Thomas considered fighting, considered forcing them to shoot him, but some survival instinct held back. He surrendered without resistance and was taken back to Riverside Manor in chains. Colonel Whitmore was furious learning Thomas had attempted escape. In Whitmore's view, he'd treated Thomas well, given him privileged position as skilled artisan, allowed him to live with his family for years, that Thomas would respond to a simple business transaction by running away struck Whitmore as the height of ingratitude and insubordination. He decided to make an example of Thomas to ensure all his other slaves understood that resistance wouldn't be tolerated. On Sunday morning after church services, Whitmore had all his slaves assembled in the area between main house and slave quarters. More than 200 people gathered, including children and elderly, everyone required to witness what was about to happen. A whipping post stood in the area center, a permanent fixture serving as constant reminder of the violence underlying the entire system. Thomas was brought out by 2 overseers who stripped off his shirt and tied his hands to the post, stretching arms above his head so his back was completely exposed. Whitmore stood on the main house porch, where he could be clearly seen and heard by everyone present. He announced that Thomas would receive 50 lashes as punishment for attempted escape, and that this was merciful compared to what he deserved. Then he nodded to Davis, the overseer, who picked up the whip. The whip used for punishing slaves wasn't like a horse whip. It was specifically designed to cause maximum pain and damage to human flesh. The leather thong was thick at the handle and tapered to a thin, flexible end that would crack like a gunshot when swung properly. In experienced hands, it could lay open skin, expose muscle, even crack bones if applied with enough force. Davis was very experienced. The first lash made a sound like a pistol shot, and Thomas's body jerked against the post. The second lash crossed the first, creating an X pattern of torn flesh on his back. By the 10th lash, blood was running down his back, soaking into his pants. By the 20th, he'd stopped making sounds, his voice gone from screaming. By the 30th, he'd lost consciousness, his body hanging limp from ropes holding his wrists to the post. Davis continued whipping his unconscious body until all 50 lashes were delivered, following Whitmore's orders exactly. When it was over, Thomas's back was a horror of torn flesh and exposed muscle and bone. Dr. Hampton, present among assembled plantation masters come to witness punishment, examined Thomas and announced he'd probably survive if infection didn't set in, though he'd carry scars for life. Thomas was cut down from the post and dragged back to his cabin, left alone to recover or die, whichever came first. But Whitmore wasn't finished. As additional punishment, he announced that Thomas wouldn't be sold to Louisiana after all. Instead, he'd arranged a new sale. Thomas would be sold to a chain gang working in southern Louisiana swamps, clearing land and building levees. These gangs were notorious throughout the South as essentially death sentences. The work was brutal, performed in malarial swamps where disease was rampant. Workers were driven mercilessly by overseers who knew replacements were cheap and readily available. Men sent to swamp gangs typically survived less than 2 years. Whitmore's message was clear: Thomas would die slowly and painfully as punishment for daring to resist. But before Thomas was taken away to Louisiana, something happened that would haunt the 13 plantation masters for the rest of their lives, though they wouldn't understand its significance until much later. Thomas had regained consciousness, but was too weak to stand. He lay on his cabin floor, his destroyed back making every breath agony. For days after the whipping, the 13 men came to inspect him before transport. They wanted to see the results of their power lesson, confirm their authority had been properly demonstrated. Thomas heard them approaching, heard voices outside his cabin discussing him as if he were a dangerous animal successfully caged. They entered, and Thomas forced himself to turn his head, forced himself to look at them despite the pain even that small movement caused. He saw their faces, saw their satisfaction and contempt and complete lack of empathy. And something crystallized in his mind, some core of rage and determination deeper than pain, deeper than despair, deeper even than grief over his lost family. Thomas spoke. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, roughened by screaming and dehydration, but clear enough for all 13 men to hear. "You think you can do this and face no consequences," he said. "You think you're untouchable, but I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, on my children's lives you've stolen from me, on my wife you've torn from my arms, you will pay for this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will pay. Every single one of you. And when that day comes, you'll wish you'd never been born." The 13 men looked at each other and laughed. What could a broken slave do to them? What threat could a man about to be worked to death in a Louisiana swamp possibly represent? The oath was meaningless, the desperate curse of a powerless man trying to maintain some shred of dignity facing absolute defeat. They turned and left the cabin, still laughing, already forgetting Thomas and his empty threat as they moved on to more important matters. They had no way of knowing Thomas's oath wasn't empty. They had no way of knowing some promises are so profound, so fundamental to a person's sense of self, they become unbreakable, shaping everything that follows. They had no way of knowing that in 16 years, Thomas, calling himself by a new name, transformed by education and experience and an all-consuming desire for vengeance, would return to Natchez with a plan so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, it would become legend, whispered about in shocked tones throughout the South for generations. But before we can understand Thomas's revenge, we need to understand what happened to him in those 16 years between his oath and his return. We need to follow his journey from the cabin where he lay broken and bleeding to the moment he stepped off a riverboat in Natchez as Thomas Winchester, gentleman investor from Chicago. Because that transformation, that seemingly impossible elevation from slave to gentleman, was itself the first and most important element of his revenge. Everything else would flow from his ability to move among his enemies as an equal, unseen and unsuspected, gathering information and weaving the web that would eventually destroy them all. Thomas was transported to Louisiana in chains, loaded onto a flatboat with a dozen other slaves being sent to various Mississippi River and tributary destinations. The journey took a week, during which Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his wounded back becoming infected despite crude treatment attempts. By the time they reached the work camp in swamps south of Baton Rouge, he was delirious with fever, and the camp overseer who took delivery expressed doubt he'd survive long enough to be worth the purchase price. But Thomas did survive. Through sheer force of will, through burning need to keep the oath he'd made, he fought off the infection and slowly began recovering. The work camp was everything he'd heard, and worse. 200 men labored in waist-deep water, digging drainage canals and building levees, working dawn to dusk with only brief breaks for minimal food. The overseer and assistants used whips freely, maintaining discipline through constant violence threat. Men died regularly from accidents, disease, snakebite, or simple exhaustion, their bodies buried in unmarked swamp graves. Thomas immediately understood that to survive, he'd need to become valuable in some way, setting him apart from other workers. He began offering to repair tools and equipment, using his carpentry skills to fix broken handles and construct simple devices, making work slightly easier. The overseer, a brutal man named Cassidy who cared only about productivity, recognized Thomas's skills could be useful. He assigned Thomas to maintenance work rather than canal digging, a position marginally less dangerous and exhausting. Over the next 18 months, Thomas worked and planned. He understood escaping the work camp would be extraordinarily difficult. They were isolated in swamps, miles from any town or road. Overseers were constantly vigilant against escape attempts, and caught runaways were tortured to death as examples to others. But Thomas was patient. He repaired tools and studied the region's geography, noting where solid ground was, which waterways led toward civilization, where the overseer stored weapons and supplies. Then in April 1861, everything changed. News reached the work camp that southern states were seceding from the Union, that war was coming. The overseer and assistants became distracted, worried about their own futures. Some left to join Confederate military units. Security at the camp became lax as remaining overseers struggled maintaining control with reduced staff. Thomas waited for his moment. It came on a hot June night when a storm rolled through, heavy rain and wind covering sounds and reducing visibility. Thomas slipped away during the storm's chaos, taking a small boat used for moving supplies and disappearing into waterways crisscrossing the swamp. He traveled 3 days, sleeping during day and moving at night, before reaching solid ground and finding a road leading north. The Confederacy in 1861 was in turmoil. Men marched off to war. Women took over plantation management, and enslaved people began understanding the conflict might offer freedom opportunities. Thomas moved through this chaos carefully, avoiding white people when possible, claiming when necessary to be traveling to join his master with a Confederate regiment. His light skin and ability to speak well helped him pass casual scrutiny. He made it to Tennessee after 6 weeks of dangerous travel, and there encountered Union forces that had pushed south into the state. The Union Army had a policy of accepting escaped slaves as contraband of war, refusing to return them to Confederate owners. Thomas presented himself to a Union camp and was accepted into service as a laborer working for the Army, but not as a soldier since black men weren't yet allowed to enlist in combat units. Working with the Union Army, Thomas discovered abilities he hadn't known he possessed. His carpentry skills were valuable for building fortifications and structures. His knowledge of Southern geography made him useful as a scout who could navigate terrain and identify good camp positions. And his intelligence, finally given opportunity for expression, became apparent to officers he worked with. One of those officers was a Massachusetts chaplain named Reverend William Hartwell, a committed abolitionist who believed freed slaves should be educated and prepared for full citizenship. Hartwell noticed Thomas, saw in him a quick mind and hunger for learning. He began teaching Thomas to read and write, starting with basic letters and sounds, progressing rapidly as Thomas proved an exceptional student. Learning to read opened an entire world to Thomas. He devoured every book and newspaper Hartwell could provide. He read about history, law, philosophy, science. He read Shakespeare and Dickens, abolitionist pamphlets and constitutional arguments, everything he could get his hands on. And as he read, he began understanding intellectual frameworks white people used to justify slavery, began seeing contradictions and hypocrisies at American society's heart. Hartwell noticed something else about Thomas. His skin tone was light enough that he could potentially pass as white if dressed appropriately and carrying himself with confidence. This was an extraordinary advantage, rare and valuable. Hartwell suggested Thomas might be useful to the Union cause as a spy, someone who could move through Confederate territory without arousing suspicion. Thomas agreed, partly from gratitude to Hartwell, partly because he recognized this passing skill would be crucial for his longer-term plans. He began practicing. He studied how white Southern gentlemen dressed, how they spoke, what gestures and mannerisms mark someone as upper class. He learned to adopt a drawl when necessary, discuss cotton and politics and bloodlines with apparent expertise. And he discovered that white people saw what they expected to see. If you dressed like a gentleman and acted like a gentleman, most white people never questioned whether you belonged. Over the next 3 years, Thomas made several trips into Confederate territory, gathering intelligence about troop movements and supply lines, posing as a merchant or plantation owner traveling on business. He was never caught, never seriously suspected. The disguise worked perfectly because Confederates couldn't conceive that a black man might be capable of such sophisticated deception. The war years also gave Thomas time to think about revenge. He knew the 13 men who destroyed his family were still in Natchez, still living comfortable lives while the Confederacy fought to preserve slavery. He fantasized about killing them, about walking into the Natchez Gentlemen's Club with a gun and shooting all 13 before they even understood what was happening. But Thomas was too intelligent, too strategic to settle for simple murder. He wanted something more profound, more devastating than quick deaths. He wanted to destroy them the way they destroyed him, to take everything they valued and grind it into dust. Gradually, as war continued and Thomas continued his education, an idea began forming. These men prided themselves on honor, reputation, society position. They saw themselves as gentlemen, moral leaders, civilization's defenders. What if he could destroy those self-images? What if he could expose them as frauds and hypocrites, make them objects of mockery and contempt? What if he could hurt them in ways making them wish for death? When war ended in 1865, Thomas faced a choice: try finding his wife and children scattered across the South, locations unknown, or dedicate himself to revenge against the 13 men who'd scattered them. He chose revenge, with understanding he'd search for his family while preparing vengeance, that the two goals weren't incompatible. Thomas moved to Chicago where he could disappear into a large northern city's anonymity and access resources and opportunities impossible in the South. He used carpentry skills to establish a legitimate business, building furniture for the city's growing middle class. He was talented and reliable, and his business prospered. Within 2 years, he'd accumulated enough capital to expand, hiring other craftsmen and establishing a reputation for quality work. But business was never Thomas's primary focus. His real work happened evenings and Sundays. He spent hundreds of library hours, continuing education Hartwell had started. He studied law and business, literature and philosophy, art and music, accumulating all cultural knowledge marking someone as educated and refined. He learned which wines were fashionable, which books everyone claimed to have read, which artistic movements were currently favored. He studied etiquette, memorizing complicated rules governing upper-class interactions. He hired a voice coach, a theatrical professional who helped eliminate any remaining traces of Southern slave dialect from his speech, adopting instead the refined accent of educated Northern society. They worked on pronunciation, rhythm, and cadence, subtle markers distinguishing cultured speech from common. Thomas practiced for hours daily, recording himself and listening back, correcting every vowel and consonant until his speech was indistinguishable from someone born into privilege. He transformed himself physically as well. Good tailoring, careful grooming, right accessories, all helped create a successful gentleman's image. Thomas learned to carry himself with confidence and authority white society associated with their own class. He practiced walking into rooms as if he owned them, making eye contact as an equal rather than subordinate, speaking with assumption his opinions mattered. The transformation took years. Thomas was patient, methodical, understanding rushing would be fatal to plans. He needed to become so thoroughly convincing in his role as Thomas Winchester, successful businessman and gentleman, that no one would ever question whether he was exactly what he appeared to be. He needed to erase Thomas the slave completely, bury that identity so deep even people who'd known him wouldn't recognize him in new form. During these preparation years, Thomas also maintained a Southern contact network. He corresponded with former slaves scattered during war, Union veterans settled in Southern states during Reconstruction, sympathetic whites working with the Freedmen's Bureau. Through this network, he gathered intelligence about what had happened to the 13 plantation masters after war. He learned they'd all survived, though fortunes damaged by emancipation. Their wealth, based entirely on slave labor, had collapsed. Many lost plantations or were forced to break them up and sell parcels. But they were still alive, still influential in communities, still wielding power over freed black population through economic pressure and political manipulation. Thomas also tried desperately finding his wife and children. He placed carefully worded notices in newspapers across the South, advertisements claiming to be looking for war-displaced family members. He wrote Freedmen's Bureau offices asking them to search records for anyone matching his family's descriptions. He sent letters to Louisiana and Mississippi contacts asking them to make inquiries. But war and emancipation chaos had scattered millions, and record-keeping was minimal or non-existent. In 1867, Thomas received devastating news. A letter arrived from a woman named Sarah who'd known Clara at Belle Rose Plantation in Louisiana. Sarah wrote that Clara had died during yellow fever epidemic sweeping Louisiana that summer. She'd fallen ill and declined rapidly, dying within a week. She'd been buried in Plantation Cemetery in an unmarked grave. Sarah expressed condolences and mentioned Clara had often spoken of her husband and children, never stopped hoping to find them again. Thomas read the letter multiple times, unable to fully process what it meant. His wife was dead. The woman he'd loved for nearly 20 years, his children's mother, was gone. He would never see her again, never have chance to tell her he'd survived, never stopped searching for her. For weeks, Thomas couldn't function. He went through daily life motions, but internally he was paralyzed by grief. Eventually, grief began transmuting into something colder and harder. His wife was dead, but his oath remained. The 13 men who destroyed his family were still alive, still comfortable, still unpunished. Thomas's commitment to revenge, which might have weakened if